Well, thank you for joining us this afternoon for Seventh Generation Interfaith Annual Conference. To all our members, our guests, our supporters, we thank you for joining us in this mission and our topic of tonight on impact investing. Special welcome to our new members from St. Louis, the Midwest Coalition for Responsible Investing, who merged with us this summer and brought our membership to 39 members. Can we recognize our Midwest Coalition? I want to recognize also our sponsors. We have a sponsor board here, some of which are our members, some are investment advisors and money managers. They allow us to continue our work, and they're a very important aspect of our mission. I finally want to recognize the Seventh Generation Board of Directors. These folks all have day jobs, most of them have multiple day jobs, as I've said in the past, but they take time out and give us guidance and support, and I could always tap them for advice. Can I get my board to maybe stand up and be recognized? Thank you. So I'm now going to ask our host, Professor Bill Lee, to say a few words of welcome.
Thanks, Frank. Good afternoon. All right, I love it. Everybody's all ready for a great session. Well, welcome again to Marquette. We're glad to host the program here today. In fact, I was telling Frank a little earlier, one of the things that's interesting about our students. So my role at Marquette is I'm the director for the Center of Supply Chain Management. In fact, and one of my colleagues is here today, my associate director, Kelly Wesolowski, who's done a lot of work to make sure that this happens. But the other thing that I wanted to mention was that in talking to students, one of the things that's very important to this particular generation of student is they want to go and work for a company or an organization that makes a difference. And making a difference can happen in a lot of ways, but they're really focused on a lot of the social issues and challenges that face our world. In fact, last semester I taught a group of seniors, and one of the things that I did was I showed them a video by Professor Michael Porter, who, if you know the name, he's the father of corporate strategy. So I said, well, why is he showing me a video of Michael Porter? Well, Michael Porter made the point that if there's anyone in the world who has the resources and the capabilities to solve the social issues that face us today, it's business. Business is where wealth is created, not governments, not agencies. A lot of hard work going on in those places, but just not enough. And I showed him the video, and all these students were sitting literally on the edge of their seat. And when he was done, they were so excited about the opportunity to go into business and make a difference. And what you do is you help organizations by giving them that little push to get it done. So I think you've got a really exciting and informative session today, and look forward to meeting you during the conference. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. I'm now going to ask Sister Ruth Battaglia of the Congregation of St. Agnes to start us off with a few words of reflections to bring both our minds and our spirit to this space. Sister.
O Holy One, we ask you to bless this gathering and all of our collective efforts to be responsible and compassionate in our corporate, financial, and social engagements. Deepen within us our desire for a world where human rights are respected and all of creation is treasured and protected. Strengthen our conviction that we are all one family sharing a common home. may we live together in peace and love. Enlighten us that we may be inspired in faith and deeply committed to build a more just and sustainable world for those most vulnerable, integrating social and environmental values into corporate and investor actions. We give you thanks, O Holy One, for our many blessings, for successes, and for those challenges that stretch us and make us grow. With grateful hearts, we lift up those who collaborate with us and support us. Sustain them in truth and goodness. And inspire us now through this evening's presentation, panel, and conversation to continue with dedication and perseverance the mission that you, O Holy One, have entrusted to us. Amen.
Thank you, Sister Ruth. Now, although most of our work at Seventh Generation Interfaith is focused on corporate engagements, our members practice various strategies in stewardship of their financial resources, including investment of a portion of their portfolio in opportunities that bring both a financial as well as a social return. What has been called community investment or alternative investing is now more commonly known as impact investing. I feel very fortunate to introduce a colleague and a friend who will give us a historic and a current perspective on impact investing. Father Seamus Finn is the Director of Justice, Peace, and the Integrity of Creation for the Missionary Oblate of Mary Immaculate. He's responsible for faith-consistent investing program for the Oblate Investment Pastoral Trust. His office works on advocacy in the public sector at international and international levels through active shareholder ownership of shares in corporations. Seamus is recognized as a pioneer in socially responsible investing, working alongside our founder, my mentor, Father Mike Crosby. He is an internationally recognized authority on sustainable development goals, impact investing, and various other investment justice topics, speaking at conferences and symposium convened at the Vatican and various locations throughout the world. I have the privilege of sitting with Seamus on the board of the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility, where he serves as our board chair. I've seen him give voice to the voiceless, taking firsthand witness of mining communities in Chile, garment factories in Bangladesh, and neighborhoods in the U.S. suffering from subprime loans and predatory payday lending, and bringing that witness to faith gatherings and boardrooms alike. Please welcome Seamus to our gathering.
So thanks much, Frank, for those generous words. I feel like the ghost of Mike Crosby will be right here perched behind my head during most of this presentation. Mike and I shared a room with about 3 others at a conference in the Philippines about 35 years ago. It was memorable, let's put it that way. In a lot of different ways, because it was both very warm, which none of us was enthused about, and we were all getting to that certain age where sleeping habits tend to, crash up against one another, whether it's sounds in the night or bathroom trips or all that. But anyway, Mike, this is for you. Just returned from Amsterdam, where I was the last few days, for the Global Impact Investing Annual Conference. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. That's a new creature in the zoo in the investment side in a lot of ways, but indeed has the signs and the legacy of lots of stuff that many of you in the room have already been doing, but now crystallized and formalized into a very powerful organization. I was mentioning to somebody that the conference was at the Amsterdam Convention Center, a building which was created in the 15th century, in case you're feeling young, where at least they remember or they tell you that some of the first bonds and stocks were traded not electronically, but in a very old-time fashion of just looking for a buyer and gathering sellers together. Feel great to be back in Milwaukee. This is my second visit to Marquette in a few weeks. The taxi driver who picked me up and brought me over here said, "Do I detect a little twang there, sir?" And I said, "Yes, as do I." As do I in you. He said, "Well, I'm from Germany. Where are you from?" I said, "Well, I think that bridges two of the sides of Milwaukee and some of the history." I was also mentioning, as I mentioned to the group earlier, one of my first visits here was to Duluth, but then the other was to Sheboygan when we were working with a group of farmers back 35 years ago, and visited the cheese exchange in Green Bay. As I mentioned, it was open for a half an hour on Friday morning, so you had to be on time and be sure what it was you wanted to get out of that. And that was actually a corporate responsibility engagement with Kraft and pricing of cheese. So to the impact investing question. In many ways, this comes, if you think of what socially responsible investors and faith-based investors is doing, along a continuum. In many ways, the continuum, I would say that it begins with creating an investment policy that many communities, many individuals do, and goes all the way over here to now what we are discussing in terms of impact investing. Let me just trace it very quickly. First, we were about avoiding a negative screening, things we didn't want to deploy capital into. And that could have been major corporations, it could have been industries, it could have been sectors, it could have been geographies. And many of us spent a great amount of time fine-tuning that particular approach and have labored to finally get the community, the finance community, to recognize that simply by avoiding the things you don't want to invest in does not harm your return on investment. That's been a long journey. But the research is clearly there and available to anybody who is interested in finding it. The second piece and the second step along the continuum was engagement. And we did an awful lot of that. And that's, again, a very big umbrella. Engagement might have been simply not deep-sixing the annual proxy when you got it, or filing them all in the corner, but you never quite got to them on time. But it was about simply voting proxies. And it was recognizing what your responsibility as an owner. You own shares. You're a part owner of the company. You own a house, you own a car, whatever it is you own. We recognize that in the field of ethics and in law and in morality comes with ownership responsibility and how that's carried out. And one of the very simple steps for many people was voting proxies. Some of you in the room have attended annual general meetings, the nightmare of annual general meetings that has now moved and changed so significantly. I used to attend an awful lot of bank annual meetings. They were all seemingly around the same 10 days in New York, most of them down around Wall Street at the Cooper Union or in different places, and the banks you all know. But we also always had 3 or 4 people there who felt like they needed to tell us about their admiration for the CEO And of course, the CEO played off of this because it kept the rest of us on the sidelines. But they showed up regularly, and they were on a first-name basis. They talked about each other's kids and passed the time to the, at the meeting to say that, well, time's up, we don't really have time for any other business. Hopefully we've moved beyond that with a lot of corporations, and annual general meetings have become something that lots of shareholders feel very comfortable attending and participating in. And we had all those things at the beginning of those meetings and those proxy statements. Voting for the members of the board of directors. Boring, right? But for many, it became and has become a real question about governance. We started out just by looking and saying, wow, they couldn't find anybody but a white male to cover this, or who has expertise in this area. It was easy. You were looking, just to get them to put the photographs in there was helpful, all right? That speeded it up a small bit. You could talk about diversity, and you could learn at least to push. Qualifications for the subject matter around which they were expected to talk about. On compensation, on risk, you name it. Filing resolutions, and again, something that comes with both the responsibility but the rights of ownership. ICCR, the organization whose board I've had the privilege of sharing in recent years, last year we were connected with some 250 stockholder resolutions. They didn't all go to a vote, but it does suggest that you want to put in front of the major management of the corporation issues that you think they are not paying adequate attention to. And they could span a whole continuum. Strategic dialogues and roundtables. Spending more than 5 minutes talking about an issue. Gathering together peers in the industry and talking about water, talking about food, talking about human rights for a couple of hours, for a day. Bringing in some experts to look at it from this side, that side, in search of objectivity and in search of truth, not in search simply of profit and advantage. And finally, engaging regulators and public policy leaders. I'm not sure how many of you have been in DC. The SEC found a brand new home over there by Union Station, but used to dread going to the SEC. If there were, I don't know, we have an awful lot of attorneys in Washington, D.C., but I think a good number of them are in the SEC, right? And they all have these very small areas of expertise, whether it's the rules about what shareholders can or cannot do, what companies have to report on, what you can put in a resolution, and yet engage them you must. And then you walk over a few blocks and there are the committees of Congress that have plenty of hearings on keeping shareholders at bay or protecting the rights of corporations. All of that comes under the umbrella, I would argue, of engagement. And you can dip your toe in, and some of you have in all of those areas, or some of them, but that's active ownership. The search in the last 30 years, but more pointedly in the last 10 or 15 years, has been, besides avoiding what I do not want to invest in, how can I articulate that to say, here's what I want to promote, here's what I want to support, and are there enough investable products and projects out there for me to be able to deploy my capital in a way that's contributing to a better world, that's contributing to a better planet, that's contributing to livelihoods that are filled with dignity, and whatever area it's in. And so, I thought it was never going to come, absolutely. I mean, it was always about critique, it was always about prophetic denunciation, it was always about what you shouldn't do and why we don't like what you are doing, and then saying, well, what should we turn our attention to if we're going to do that? And the Holy Father has done that a number of times. I'd commend to you his speech in Mauritius at the end of September of this year. It was a brilliant speech. because he points out there that the responsibility for turning the dial just away from avoiding what you don't want to support to in the direction of what you do want to promote is within reach of all of us and each of us, and that there is a group and a team effort that can help us to do that. The landscape goes back quite a ways, and looking at some of the faces in the room, you'll say, well, impact investing, what exactly, how do you go about that? And I know many religious communities and many, I'm sure others, were involved in microfinance back 30, 40 years ago. The microfinance was a very simple instrument. It was trying to put together a bunch of capital that could be deployed to people that the financial institutions would not lend to. Whether it was a group of women in the highlands of Bolivia, whether it was a small and medium-sized enterprise on the streets of Guatemala City. And it was built around a relationship of trust, that people can become literate in these things. And even if you're only lending them $100, that it does provide the capital and the resources for them to get whatever little business they're running, whether it's in food or in trinkets or in souvenirs, that they're able to produce that on a daily basis or bring their product, whatever they're growing in their gardens to market. It provides the bridge and financing them to be able to do that. And lots of folks jumped into that in all kinds of different ways. The difficulty with it is, of course, is that it was labor intensive. Bankers will always tell you it takes as much effort to administer a loan of 5,000 as it does of 5 million, right? It's just a number of zeros, but the due diligence is still there, and it takes paperwork and it takes monitoring. And gratefully, in microfinance, we had a model that now has been able, through a variety of things, but technology, I would argue, has been one of the great accelerators, has made much of the drudgery of that work much more, brought it much more to somebody's fingertips, that now I can take out my phone and I can transfer the $100 without ever leaving my desk, right? Or while I'm having my coffee in the morning. And I can monitor and get a report back to say, what are the stumbling blocks, who did it help, how did it work? Lots of other stuff in terms of the forerunners of impact investing were lines of credit, were tools like loans at first of all, risky loans that banks wouldn't, people that banks considered not trustworthy or not able to show a business model where they would repay. Community development finance institutions. Very interesting, there's a section in the U.S. Catholic Bishops Guidelines in 1986, 1987, that talks specifically about this. It doesn't get a lot of attention, because they still like to know what it is we're against and what we won't invest in. But it does suggest clearly that this is a viable way in which people of faith can demonstrate and can live out and commit themselves to the works of charity. They even have in there that you shouldn't be using a bank that doesn't get an outstanding rating from their community, their CRA report, right? So, and that's a very simple piece to follow. The second piece on what's happened now on the impact investing front is the battle we're in is where are we in terms of labor intensity and concessional lending and market rate return. So if I'm going to take huge amounts of my portfolio and put it over into impact, but I still need a return, is it possible to do it? Are there enough funds out there? Are there enough projects out there where that can happen? And gratefully, it's happening and continues to explode in my estimation in ways that I certainly never expected. You're probably familiar with things like green bonds. You're probably familiar with things like social impact bonds. I first learned about social impact bonds when I was visiting with some treasurers in Ireland, of all places. And they had put together a number of social impact bonds, had gone to the government and said, here's the way that this works. Here are the projects in terms of working with the homeless or assisted living shelters that we think you are contracting with people about, and we think we can do it more effectively, and we can also deploy the capital in a way out of which the service rendered to those and to those in need is going to be more effective. 3 conferences at the Vatican on impact investing in the last 8 years, co-sponsored by Catholic Relief Services, the Dicastery for the Promotion of Integral Human Development, and the Mendoza School of Business at Notre Dame. This was a big step. First, it was in the Catholic tradition, was to explore the topic in the context of Catholic social teaching. Where does it fit within that body of Catholic social teaching? If, for those of you who are scholars or who spend a little time reading, you always remember, we always knew about Rerum Novarum and Quadragesimo Anno and Pacem in Terris, and always the presentation was, well, there's capitalism and there's socialism and there's communism, and here's what we like about this, but here's what we don't like about it. And that's been pretty much the model, right? Critique and affirmation, but no baptism for any one of those kinds of economic models. And more recently, what we've seen, particularly with Pope Francis, is somebody who's struggling himself, I think, to articulate what exactly does he want after his critique of consumer capitalism, after their critique of throwaway cultures, after their critique of the amount of money that we spend and that we waste. What is it that they would do to the system to help us to move on down the road? And more recently, the Holy Father has been talking a lot about a circular economy. But you also find other people who are writing quite a bit about things like conscious capitalism, right? You have people like Martin Wolf writing in the Financial Times about a rigged capitalism that needs reform. Thought I'd never see that sentence come out of his pen. So we've got a whole body that's wrestling with the bigger question to say there's something wrong with the model, it's not working, it's destroying the planet, it's creating great inequality, and we don't have good answers for this. And we're 7.5 billion people, and we're on our way to 10, and the carrying capacity of the Earth is limited. And that'll give you a headache, so you should probably need to take a nap after you think about those things, right? And then so looking at impact investing, it's beginning to try and say, what are some of the ways that we can find, the paths we can discern where we can be a part of that? And I'm not sure how you feel about that body on the east side of New York there, the United Nations, but I happen to appreciate some of the stuff they do. They came out with the Millennium Development Goals. And then in 2015, they came out with the Sustainable Development Goals. 183 nations of the world together, looking at the major challenges that we face, that each of those countries face, but collectively we face, on the environment, on education, on health, on all the kinds of issues that we wrestle with: food, water, sustainability, all those. And they broke it down into 17 goals and 160-something metrics. And that's been one of the keys, I think, that's pushed us. So a confluence, in my estimation, a confluence of those documents to begin to articulate, when we use the word sustainability, what do we mean? What does it mean in your household? What does it mean in your community? What does it mean locally? What does it mean globally? And can you put numbers on it? And can you put specifics on it? And then those great geniuses who do the algorithms and all the other computer programming, have gone to work and finally created a metric for that squishy stuff. I love it when these hardcore scientists start to talk about the squishy stuff that you can't measure, right? That's the qualitative stuff. That's the poetry, that's the prose, that's the music that you enjoy at the theater. What is it bringing to my life? How do I add this up? How do I know if I've had too much of it, right? And now all of a sudden, in that squishy side, we're beginning to get metrics. And we're beginning to get data. And so the conferences at the Vatican, first of all, we're exploring the theme. Where does it fit within what we consider to be Catholic social teaching? How do you identify some projects and some ways in which this might go forward? The second goal of those conferences was, how do you sponsor funds? Is somebody going to jump into the deep end here? That's always a question, right? For anybody who's ever put any kind of financial project together, and fund together in particular, it goes on for pages, and there's a lot of signing off on lots of legalities, because we know there's risk involved. And somebody has to be able to be held accountable, first of all, but also to be able to measure how it's worked out. And so finally, we've got the Dominicans of North America put last year and launched their fund on climate solutions. A great piece of work, working with Morgan Stanley. So we all talk about climate change. We're not quite sure what to do about it. We think we've got some answers. But how do you actually put together a $50 million fund that different people can invest in, all taking pieces of the risk, that then is deployed in terms of supporting some of the alternative energies that will address the climate change issues? The Missio Invest of the Pontifical Mission Societies has created an agriculture fund for small farms in Africa and church-owned land by sisters and by seminaries. Providing loans sometimes no bigger than $50,000. But $50,000 brings 2 tractors, or it brings an irrigation system that then expands out into the larger community. And done in such a way that the fund extends over the usual period of time of 5 or 7 or 10 years. So you can measure it. Your financial advisor can tell you, can I handle this much risk or can I not? So that's a whole new torrent of data and information that we didn't have that makes impact investing come very closer to home and that we can actually consider it. And finally, I think on the impact investing front, what we've got now is lots of folks in the field, in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, who are beginning to try to actually learn about financial literacy, be able to create business models, and be able to understand, yes, they need a grant for this, they need a loan for that, they need equity for this, and they're putting together a blended financial instrument that's allowing them over a period of time to build something and not simply be dependent on foreign aid, whether it's from the European Union or the United States or wherever, because we know that spigot is drying up every year. So the impact investing piece of the puzzle, it seems to me, where it is at the moment, and this was on full display over there at the conference in Amsterdam, is that in most of the things that you and I want to support, whether domestically or internationally, there is somebody sitting down trying to figure out how do you put together the needed capital to make this possible? And how do you build it in such a way that people will be willing to deploy their capital? And some may want to deploy an amount of money that they can put in there, but they just want the capital back. And others may not be able to do that, but to say, well, I need 2%. But then the larger corpus, for most folks, is saying, I need a market rate of return. So you've got along the spectrum here, right? Lots of data points that allows the person who is charged with fiduciary responsibility to manage money and to make the kind of return that's needed for whatever the mission is of the local parish, of the local congregation, to guarantee or at least to be able to assure them that it's being prudently managed and prudently deployed. So you've cut, it seems to me, a confluence of data, technology, and things like the Sustainable Development Goals, and experience coming way back from 30, 40 years ago of the kinds of work that people did in microfinance to put together a project that may be supporting 50 coffee farmers in the highlands of Peru, because they're growing a particular kind of coffee that they love in Chicago, or they love as a premium kind of coffee, or they want fresh fruit in London, or they want better tulips in Amsterdam, right? And it's in the midst of the market conversation that they're able to put together a model that's not dependent on the philanthropy or the charity of the countries that in the past have made that a part of their foreign aid budget. It's giving them the building blocks whereby they can build something for themselves and for their children. And we can be part of that. And I think this is part of what Pope Francis is trying to get us to focus on when he talks about the circular economy question. Or some of the folks involved in the conscious capitalism debate are trying to get us to focus on. And we can begin, I think, to do that because we've got the wherewithal and the tools and the know-how and the experience to do that. What are the questions and challenges that come up around this? Obviously, the biggest one, it seems to me, is about the role of the private sector in these particular projects. And my friends in the development community are constantly raising this. They are used to a particular style of operating that takes a $200 million project from USAID that's supposed to respond to a particular set of issues in Malawi and design a project that's totally dependent on that corpus of money, which is eventually going to run out after a couple of years. Because the question about the private sector involvement is about motivation and trust, right? When you get the private sector involved in something like trying to address development and address poverty, they have mixed motives. Their motives are not as pure as those who are down there grinding it out on a daily basis. But the UN itself, in its proposals to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, has clearly said, and as it's Billy, is it? We had a pitcher for the Red Sox named Billy, right, didn't we? Spaceman, that's right, yeah, I just thought of that. Anyway, as Bill mentioned in his opening comment, it's the private sector that has the capital that's going to deliver the ability to address some of these issues. But how do you put together the framework and the principles and the guidelines within which they do that is the challenge. We know and we get very upset when the private sector gets involved in prisons. It was on the agenda and the meeting here this afternoon. And then there are countless stories about what's their role in the immigration debate at the moment. We get upset when we find they're getting involved in the health sector and delivery of health services. We get upset with charter schools, right? These are all forms of the same kind of discomfort that we have when you take the private sector and allow them to enter into what we have often thought to be responsibilities of government and the way in which they might achieve that. And I would strongly argue that the only way we can find out the answers to some of these questions is by measuring it and evaluating it and see if it works. And not all of it will work. We've gotten used to private sector involvement in highway construction. Not sure that you like the tolls. You probably don't have many of those out here in Wisconsin. We've got plenty of them in California and plenty of them on the East Coast, right? We've gotten used to their involvement in some areas that we think it's a better mix for what we're trying to achieve. We'll have to work this out. But as we go forward, I know in my own community, for instance, one of the vehicles that is very much in play when it comes to impact investing is private equity. Now, we had a fairly staunchy, stolid, conservative investment committee in my community. And, you know, they knew the stuff. You do this much with equities, this much with bonds, and you make sure you have enough cash, and the liquidity questions are all answered. And then this other kid came into the room, as it were, when people started talking about, well, maybe if you're looking for alpha, you ought to start looking at private equity. And it took about 3 years for at least a level of comfort to say, is it an asset class? Not sure. How does it work? We need to learn. Is it something that actually can respond to specific issues in specific countries more quickly and more effectively than some of the ways in which we've done it in the past? And I think slowly but surely you are now seeing private equity funds put together specifically to deliver impact on the agriculture sector, in the education sector, in the health delivery service sector. Again, they need to be evaluated. Does it work? Does it not? But for the investment committee, at least, that needs to be a part of the conversation. Needs to be a part of where does it fit within however you're trying to deploy your assets. There were $450 billion was absorbed last year by private equity and venture capital. 450 billion. Obviously, there's a lot of people out there who are big believers. Does it work every time? No. Should there be an opportunity for us to look at it and consider it? I think so. Gives us and has given us, for instance, a way to deploy capital into 7 countries in East Africa that we're that are a priority for us. A bank, a fruit company, a wine company in Ethiopia, a beef company in Ethiopia. You sit down, you look at them, you evaluate them, you discuss them. And the investment committee is looking over your shoulder and saying, well, this has to fit within the asset allocation and the return has to be competitive. Otherwise, it has to go over into the concessional, philanthropic, charitable side. So impact covers a broad sweep, is what I simply want to say. And it can be local, and it's regional, and international. We like it because it fits well. We're an international congregation. We're in about 65 different countries. And so we do want to be able to connect with our colleagues in those different countries and target impact that we want to have in specific areas, whether it is education or agriculture or whatever. Let me close by adding 2 other comments on this because I think it's important for us as we go down. The added value on the impact conversation, and impact is not a mystery word. It means, can you measure what the impact of what you're doing is, right? What you see happening is now the Walmarts and the Targets and the other companies of the world want to wave their arms and say, don't forget about us. We create impact too. Right? We give jobs. We provide health care. We do this, we do that. What's it doing? It's pushing them to be able to give you a report in their sustainability report or their CSR report that's much more robust. It's not about telling stories about Maria or Jose or anybody in any other part of the world and say, this is what it did. There's real data there that you can chew on. And that's substantive data. And so what you've got is, I think, a whole pressure to kind of compete in this space. I'm sure, and I heard these institutions, and they'll be known to some of you this afternoon, people like Sustainalytics, ISS, MSCI, all of those, I'm sure they've approached us 3 or 4 times in the last 12 months to say, we have a product that measures ESG, and we think you'll be interested in it. We're saying, wow, we didn't think you could measure any of that stuff. Environment, social, governance. Rating companies on where they fit within their environmental impact, their social footprint, the quality of the board of directors, quality of the governance. I don't know about you, but my training is not in finance, and I was never interested in spending hours reading annual reports, particularly the financial section. But this makes sense, that you can now have a report that reports on the financial side, on the social side, on the environmental side, and on the quality of the governance. And that's a real plus. That's a real advantage for anybody who's trying to figure out, where can I put my money that nobody's going to steal it? Where am I going to put my money that it's going to have maximum impact? Where am I going to be able to put my money where there'll be adequate transparency in the report that I receive so that I can actually say, wow, it accomplished this. It enabled that. It facilitated this piece. And that's new. Much of it made possible by things like this and things like this, and the rest of us pushing financial advisors, pushing money managers, pushing corporations to deliver and to be able to measure, so that when we feel bad about where we're not getting with the Sustainable Development Goals, and they give you those reports every few years, we will have one soon in New York, and it's saying, well, we didn't meet our goals last year, or Kosovo didn't quite measure up in achieving its climate assessment goals. So that's fine. I mean, we've all got report cards over our lifetime, whether they were in the 2nd grade or in the 8th grade, and there was always room for improvement. That's my approach. Right? But it's important to have a record out of which we can build and on which we can build. Let me stop at that stage by finally suggesting, I think, for instance, if you haven't been following closely, the Synod on the Amazon that opened yesterday at the Vatican is a great place to think about this. It's writing on a huge canvas. It's writing about challenges that are beyond each of us, and in areas that we think sometimes are a bit off-putting or a bit strange. Somebody complained yesterday about whoever brought up the offertory gifts at St. Peter's, about his headdress. I think the Pope said this morning, I thought it was beautiful. Compared to some of the hats that some people wear around here, I'll go with it any time. So it's shifting around our ways of looking at things, shifting around our way of appreciating what it is finances and capital can do, and maybe taking a second look when it comes to impact, taking a second look in how we measure it, and taking a second look in how we put together report cards and celebrate what we're able to do. And I think I could give you numerous examples on that, but I promised I'd stop before I got to the end of 45 minutes, and I'm going to, so thank you.
How about one more applause for Father Seamus, huh? I'll ask our panelists, please, to go ahead and take their places up here, and I'll just share a few words with you briefly as they're assembling up here. My name is Chris Cox. I'm the Associate Director of Seventh Generation Interfaith. And if you want to come around and use the steps, or, yeah. So based on what you've heard so far, let me just ask this question of the people here in attendance. And if you're in the back, please feel free to take a seat, especially right now. It's a great opportunity. We don't want everybody. There are some good Catholics in the house, it seems, so the front pew is open, if you will. But also for those of other faiths, there's plenty of room up front. So asking this question then, so far, based on what you've heard, I'd ask you to think about either the institution you're a part of or your own holdings. Are you a part of an institution or individually doing impact investing already? Please raise your hand if that's the case. Wow, that's more than we were expecting ahead of time. Okay, so now you all that raised your hands can keep them down. And now this question, the next 3 sub-questions are directed to all of you who did not raise your hand. Okay? Of those of you who did not raise your hand, how many of you believe that to do that, to do impact investing, you'd need a market return to justify it? That's not a barrier for anybody? Okay, let's try this one. How many of you would say that the challenge of finding a good investment opportunity or good vehicle for that is a challenge to being able to do it? Like, I do this, but I just don't know where to do it. Anyone want to raise their hand around that one? A few hands. Okay, a few more on that. One last. What about the challenge of measuring that impact? It sounds like a really good thing, but can you show me the data? Is that a barrier for anybody? Anybody want to raise their hand on that one? Saw a couple nods. Oh, we got at least one hand. Okay. So to think about some of the kinds of things, trying to plant, if you will, some of the kinds of things that may be obstacles for people doing that as we prepare to hear from our panel here. We've assembled a group of experts in the field who hope to answer these questions and others and share their passion about this socially responsible investing strategy. I want to introduce, first of all, then our moderator, who will introduce the other panelists. That's Sister Dorothy Pagosa. She is a sister of St. Joseph of the Third Order of St. Francis.
Twice removed from the River Clare. No, anyhow.
And directs the justice and peace efforts of her community. Before that, she also directed the 8th Day Center in Chicago.
I was one of the members of the 8th Day. There were no directors. That was one of our avant-garde things.
Less hierarchical than we men, much more collaborative, So with that, I will pass it off to Sister Dorothy.
Thank you very much. Do you all have your mics on? Okay, fantastic. Well, I'm really pleased. Thank you, Father Seamus, for introducing the whole idea of impact investing. And we're so delighted tonight to have 4 people here who are living out the idea of positive impact investing. And I'll introduce them to you now. Greg Lane, right there, is the CFO of the Missionary Sisters of the Sacred Heart. Did you say they're the Cabrini Sisters?
Yes.
The Cabrini Sisters. Ken Vander Weele is the partner and co-founder of Creation Investments Capital Management, LLC. Salli, Martyniak, oh wow, is president of Forward Community Investments. And Mr. George Hinton, the CEO of Social Development Commission, and he really went out of his way. He had 2 major events today, one before this and one after this. So thank you so much for having us be part of this. So what we hope to do is hear from each of our friends here and have a dialogue going eventually about how they interact with each other. We have people from the communities, people from the people who are impacted, investment managers, so I think we can have a good dialogue going. And Greg, I'm going to put you on the spot first. Greg is an asset owner. He directs...
I represent
You represent an asset owner. No, this is news to you, right? You're the asset owner. Could you describe the mission of the Cabrini Sisters and how impact investing plays into that? And I think you have some exciting news about what your community is involved in now.
Yes.
The pledge.
So our mission is to spread the love of Christ to the world's most vulnerable population with an apostolic focus on women, children, frail elders, refugees, and immigrants. We are currently in 17 countries. Our sponsored ministries include education, healthcare, immigrant outreach services, among others. And similar to a lot of religious congregations, our membership has been declining for quite some time. We still have, some very active, vibrant membership, and we have temporal goods, which consists of money and real property. And so our current leadership made a decision a couple of years ago to intentionally use our temporal goods to do mission, and our impact investment experience was really born out of that decision. And this was a real paradigm shift, because historically mission and finance were separate, but we are now intentionally putting finances at the service of mission and charism.
And then I found out today that the Cabrini Sisters are one of a number of communities that are involved in a new effort, Pledge for Impact Investing.
Yes, so this is hot off the press. I actually have the press release here.
Breaking news. Okay.
So in a new and unprecedented effort, the Catholic Impact Investing Collaborative is rolling out its Catholic Impact Investing Pledge, a public commitment to incorporate investments with a positive impact. And this pledge was signed by half a dozen of prominent Catholic impact investors, including Ascension Health, the Franciscan Sisters of Mary, Mercy Investment Services, and the Missionary Sisters of the Sacred Heart. And it's really just it's a way to catalyze interest and to get other Catholic investors and non-Catholic investors, other faith-based investors to commit assets to impact investing.
Okay.
So it's exciting.
I thought so, so I'm glad you were able to bring that to us. Yeah. Now, Ken Vanderville, you're a developing country asset manager. Tell us about your company and how you personally came to the work, and also what companies you invested in, the usual.
We are a traditional private equity fund, invest only in emerging markets and only in financial service companies that serve low-income clients, which includes traditional microfinance, which is a big part of our portfolio, as well as like motorbike finance companies or specialty asset companies, really serving lower-end, lower-income clients. We've been at it for 10 years since we started. My co-founder, Patrick Fisher, has gone to some of the Vatican conferences. We've just finished our fourth fundraise, so these are traditional closed-end, high-alpha funds. We are seeking above-market returns. We want to be in the top quartile of private equity for emerging markets. Data is still not quite there yet, but I think we are getting some good exits. That was always the challenge, and could we actually invest in these things? They're great companies, great returns, but could we actually exit them? And we've had 2 IPOs this year in India, so we are beginning to see some real returns coming out of these things. So it's been an exciting venture. As a traditional private equity fund, the general partners are heavily invested, so since my wife's in the room, I won't tell you what percentage of our net worth, but it's fairly high. But I'm on my 4th career. I'm old enough to be there. I started out as a CPA, sometimes call myself a recovering CPA, but second career was doing domestic private equity, where I actually did make some money. My 3rd career, which Linda, my wife, is still doing, was an NGO called Opportunity International, which was an early player in microfinance. So we lived around the world, created microfinance companies, first in Eastern Europe, and a bit in Africa and India. So a lot of on-the-ground, hands-on experience, a lot of mistakes, a lot of scars from things I wish I had done differently. But that was a good background for my current role, investing in impact. And so it's been an exciting journey this last 10 years to be able to convince traditional investors that we can generate return doing impact in financial inclusion investments. Our investors are about half private family office, high net worth investors, and about half institutions, including several Catholic institutions. But most of the institutional investors only are investing out of their impact pools. Mm-hmm. So eventually we hope we move from the little kids table to the big Thanksgiving table.
How many countries are you involved
We are globally potentially, but we're actually only in about 8 countries. We're a very small team. We're pretty focused. Mm-hmm. We've just opened an India office and a Mexico office. So we're about a third India, a third Latin America, and a third hodgepodge the rest of the world.
Great. Thank you. Now, our next 2 panelists, I think are sort of connected, right?
We are.
Yes. But let Salli start. Salli Martyniak is a local asset manager with Forward Community Investments. Why don't you tell us about that and tell us about your investors and how you got involved with impact investing?
So I never thought of us as an asset manager, but I guess that is what we do.
I'm sorry, that's what it says here.
Okay. No. We are actually, Forward Community Investments is a CDFI, a Community Development Financial Institution. And we have been around for 25 years. There are roughly 1,000 of us in the country, and 23 in the state of Wisconsin. And CDFIs were started very specifically under President Clinton to bank the unbanked and the underbanked. And it was a way to recognize the fact that that mainstream financial institutions were missing out on either individuals, small businesses, nonprofits, and were not lending money to them. So when we got started, the individuals who founded our organization started us for the purpose of addressing homelessness, very specifically in Dane County. Since that time, we've grown to be a statewide organization. And today our mission is working with organizations like Social Development Commission who are addressing issues of racial inequities and socioeconomic disparities. And to that end, we lend money for community facilities, for daycare centers, health clinics, all kinds of affordable housing, and for some social ventures as well.
That's great. Now that brings us to you, Mr. Hinton.
Hi.
And you're part of Social Development Commission. Can you tell us the mission and what you do?
Yeah.
And what your sources of funding are?
So, first of all, I thought this was black tie,
I was going to say, I feel underdressed, yes.
but that's okay. So Social Development Commission is a community action agency. We're actually one of 1,000 in the United States who was created by the Johnson administration to work in our communities at the grassroots level to help people move out of poverty. Help themselves move out of poverty. So we're an agency that works to work with people, to help them find their light, to create their plans for how that light might work for themselves and their family, and then try to help resource those things. And we're also a little different than most of our community action agencies, that we're also a commission on poverty. So way back then in the 60s, the mayor and the governor and the county exec decided there should be a commission on poverty, and they created the Social Development Commission, who's responsible for researching, understanding, and speaking to the community on issues of how we can do a better job of helping our communities move out of poverty. And so one of the advantages, one of our relationship is that we moved and wanted to buy some property because from my perspective, it was more cost effective for us as an agency to buy the property than to lease it, because I'm not running with a lot of cash. I am a business. So I have to stay within the revenue streams that I have. So for me, it was a business decision. I found a business partner who was able to give me the financing that I needed to make sure that I could create the product and services that I needed to produce for my community. I'm George Hinton. I call myself a recovering healthcare executive. My last job before taking on this role was the president of Sinai Hospital. So one of my issues is around, and I found the discussion earlier fascinating, because I think about the United States sometimes as a subset of having communities that are kind of sort of like communities around the world who are not invested in the way that they need to be to help them become self-sufficient for themselves. And so I would hope that this opportunity, and through our discussion, we would talk more about how I think people are looking for investments so that they can take care of their own communities and not to be having handouts. I think that's been a misunderstanding about many of our communities. And I think this is a true opportunity. One of the reasons why I decided to go away from one of my events in the morning come dressed up for you at this point, and then go back and do another gala for a person that did a lot of impact in our community, Mr. Ben Johnson.
Well, that's a great introduction to maybe another question that we can ask here. Mr. Hinton was talking about how this really helps people by not just having charity, but actually investing in those communities. How do you find this in the work that you're doing? As far as, I mean, you, of course, but why don't you take it?
I'm going to give an example to that,
please.
too. And it is another CAP agency, Community Action Program agency. And I was also thinking about how we measure metrics and in terms of, the work that we do when people invest in us, because our investments come from religious institutions, financial institutions, individuals who lend us their money so that we could re-lend it back into the community. And we're always asked, what are the impacts? And today something came across my desk that I was just really thinking about it. It was very appropriate. About 12 years ago, we lent money to a community action agency in rural Wisconsin. And it was to allow them to purchase a building to start a free dental clinic. And because of that free dental clinic, what happened was the fact that farmers now had access to health care that they didn't have before. And hospitals had less ER visits. But what also happened was that along the time there was also an introduction to a federally qualified health clinic that partnered with the CAP agency, and that led to the development of a dental clinic. And so now there was healthcare and dental clinic that was together. And then that partnership led to, a partnership with Head Start also happened as a result of this free clinic. And now even more people were served. And now 12 years later, and this happened over the course of time, is I received word that the donation of a used Head Start bus was made to the free clinic. And today that bus visits dairy farms around rural Wisconsin. And they're providing health care to Spanish-speaking farm workers and to farmers. And so all of that happened it's not because of our investment, it was because of a lot of hard work by the organization. But it really speaks to what investment in community means. It's not just a one-time something, it really is a trickle down and a trickle up.
Do you find this as well with the global idea of investing rather than donating to an organization? Would you like to speak?
Yeah, I mean, our business has really grown out of the whole microfinance movement, and I think a lot of good data over the years about how small loans to poor people enable them to, get jobs and create income and get their kids to school, and often the next generation then gets into the formal sector. So as some of these bigger institutions have developed, we've been really trying to invest in we're equity investors in high quality lending institutions, but typically we're seeing repayment rates 98, 99% in these institutions. Capital is being redeployed. The loans are for little small businesses, micro businesses, working capital, sometimes fixed assets. But yeah, the huge impacts. I mean, we've really seen it across the globe. And the challenge, as Reverend Seamus was talking about, is capturing that data and measuring it. And we've been investing more and more on aggregating that data in terms of job creation and income increases. And so it's been fun to watch.
That's great. Now, Mr. Hinton, you serve some of the most underserved people in the state and some of the poorest and disenfranchised people. How can they repay investments? How do they?
Well, I think it's no different than if you're thinking about investing in another country. I mean, we need capital in our economic development. We need economic development strategies in our community. We're so segregated by class. We need to start investing in those segregated areas so that those communities can then recover and take care of themselves. I think sometimes we kind of avoid the opportunities that are sitting right in our face. But we have to understand it's not just racism, it's classism in many cases. And I was just talking to Salli about this. Even in the white community, we have segregated by economics. You go into the mountains of West Virginia, you're not going to see a whole lot of people that look like me, although you will find some, because I have family in that area. But you'll see a lot of people who have a need, but it can be probably resolved by more economic development and investment. So economic development for me, I help people get out of poverty. I cannot help people get out of poverty. It's not an engine that grabs them and helps them to then have a job or create businesses that allows the community itself to start to thrive. So I think that we have opportunities. I tend to think we have more opportunities to do a lot of investing in our country that will give return. There are a lot of people out there who want to become entrepreneurs but cannot find the capital or qualify for the capital in the systems that we have today. And so it is the same type of risk, but there's a lot of people worth investing in despite the risk. And the impact would be catalytic in terms of its other types of things, sort of what you're trying to look at.
Now, Frank, how do the sisters look at the risk and the rate of return and all that? Have they had a good experience as far as getting paid back on these investments?
Well, admittedly, we've just started this process. But the way that we think about this is we made a commitment to invest up to 25% of our global portfolio into impact investing. And we're generically defining it as mostly private investments that seek measurable, positive social and/or environmental impact, which is pretty standard. And the other 75% of the portfolio is invested in, publicly traded securities that integrate positive ESG criteria. And so we used, modern portfolio theory to come up with an asset allocation for our global portfolio. And so as Father Seamus was describing, right, you allocate certain percentage to public equities, certain percentage to fixed income, and then you have this alternatives bucket. And traditional alternatives are, private equity, private debt, hedge funds. In our case, the impact investments largely fall under the alternatives, and the alternatives allocation is, probably around 30%, which is pretty large. So, we look at that impact investment allocation. We make an assumption in regard to the financial return and how it relates to the other assets. And we largely treat it like any other alternatives bucket. So it's really integrated into our global investment strategy. We're not really differentiating all that much.
Now, do you four have any questions of each other?
I did.
Go ahead.
I'm interested in it from your perspective. So what's the difference in domestic investment versus, outside of the country? Especially when they talk about the same population types.
I haven't done much domestically, although I've looked at and donated to a few programs over the years. I think the economies are so much simpler in rural India or Peru that $100 or $500 actually does make a pretty big difference. And it's just that capital boost the person needs to become sustainable or profitable, and the cycle of lending, repaying, increasing the loan sizes seems to work really well. But for a small entrepreneur in the inner city or a rural, isolated area with a Walmart not far away, it's pretty tough to compete against those kind of large-scale businesses. So I've seen domestic entrepreneurship in poverty communities as being pretty challenging from that standpoint. Also, just the economics of the institution. I mean, we pay market wages in these countries, our companies, but that's $200 a month to a college-educated loan officer in India, which is a decent salary in some of these places, where You can't do that in downtown Milwaukee. So I think it just becomes harder to make these things sustainable.
I appreciate that. Actually, I appreciate everything you just said, because it kind of helps me. One of the things I would like to say, some of this is systemic.
Yeah.
And so our challenges are not just because of the people, it's because of the systems in which we're working in. And that just the challenge of competing for funds when their alternatives are more attractive also keeps us from getting the funds we need. And it's not because people are doing anything that I don't think are wrong. They're just thinking about it in a logical way that makes sense, and that's a logical argument.
And we just have a much more sophisticated economy where these small loans are just much more challenging to make them workable.
Thanks.
What do you think about this, Sally? About investing domestically? Has it been a challenge for you?
The answer is yes and no. Partially, and I want to address something that you had said too in terms of, how you measure risk. And I do want to ask that. For us at least, and for the CDFI industry in general, and using us as an example right now, we have lent over $150 million in the last 25 years. And our losses total less than $297,000, which I think is pretty darn amazing. And we do that because of the fact that we lend on character so often. I mean, we do a very, very thorough loan analysis, and we measure collateral, we do everything else, but at the end of the day, we're lending to people. And I like to say we've had many sleepless nights, how are we going to get repaid and so forth, but we always do. And I always think about when we talk about impact investing that, we're talking about risk, the financial risk, but should we be talking more about what the benefits of it really are? And it really does mean someone getting a job. It does mean, someone raising themselves out of poverty. And sometimes you can't measure that by doing an analysis of the work that we do.
Yeah. Yeah, and we're a mission-driven organization. We definitely care about impact or impact investments. I would say it's impact first. So we're obviously looking at financial risk and return, but we're primarily looking at impact. And frankly, that's the harder part. It's the harder part to measure. And I think we're really unique. I've sadly learned that we're very unique in this arena. There aren't that many impact investors who are really impact-first investors, and I think we're in a luxurious position, to do that. To your point about CDFIs, a lot of CDFIs have excellent financial performance records. They're very good investments.
We're not alone.
You're not alone,
No.
yeah. And when we look in the developing world, and we try to follow our geographic footprint a little bit, and as I said, we're in 17 countries, most of those countries in the developing world. If we're looking at a fund structure like a private debt, fund structure, very often there are mitigants built in. There's some kind of cushion, first loss cushion built into that structure because they're newer vehicles and there are development finance institutions and foundations that are trying to catalyze those funds. So there are a lot of opportunities to pursue really good impact investments in the developing world that happen to have really nice structures that mitigate a lot of the credit risk. I don't know if it's always going to be like that, but right now we're finding it.
I know when I go to my community to talk to them about this, they're going to say, well, what good does it do? Do you have any success stories you can share, George, or about what this?
Well, I think I can speak to, there are businesses. Look, I represent poor people, so just like you represent financial institutions or people want to invest, I represent people who are in poverty, who don't want to be in poverty. Okay, and I don't care what they look like. what their sex or their gender is. People don't want to be in poverty. Nobody wants to not have enough money to feed the family. I don't know one person. Everybody wants their children to be healthy. They want to have enough money to send them to good schools and make sure that the schools that they are good. And there's some very, very bright, intelligent people in the community that just don't get the type of financial opportunities. And that's the way I look at it from the standpoint of from a business development perspective. There's some great ideas out there. There's some outstanding entrepreneurs. Some of them may be doing criminal things, but they are entrepreneurs.
Yeah.
We could turn that into engines that would be feeding the economy of our country in a different kind of way. Yes, it's risky.
Sure.
And but the opportunities are there. And one of the interesting things somebody said about I don't remember who said it was about Walmart. I've been looking at the communities that are really successful in our community. They don't have Walmarts. So Walmarts are keeping our businesses from developing. That's something we have to address in our communities. Because they may be great financial investments for you, but when you look at the social benefit to the community, they may be actually negative. Because they're not allowing the economic development necessary for the communities that are struggling to actually be able to recover. And I would say that around food, as we look at McDonald's and things like that, and those types of institutions that are providing food at a very cost-effective and probably very profitable. But the effects of that are we have children running around and individuals with hypertension and diabetes. It's actually costing our country a lot more than it would be to just put some good grocery stores in place. So part of the investment too, not only just to have an investment, is doing it in the right way, to have the right kind of outcomes, to really think about investment in a different kind of way. I get really upset when people want to invest on helping people after they get out of incarceration. We should be investing to make sure that they never go, because that is a very stupid way to spend our money in our nation. It's not very cost effective. It's not a great return on an investment. So these are the kinds of things that I like to see look differently when we talk about our communities who are poor and in need. They need to be invested in the right way so that we can truly see the returns of our investment.
Okay. How about you, Kim?
One of the companies I'm most proud of was in Sri Lanka, which had a civil war, ended about 10 years ago. They were trying to rebuild the economy. They really needed capital. A young entrepreneur, wanted to get into microfinance, scraped together about $1 million from friends and family to get a license as a CDFI type institution. They could take deposits. He grew rapidly. As we were looking at the country, 2013-14, I just saw an amazing company. His vision, his motto was simple acts of love. He's a Buddhist guy. He trained everybody around Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Successful People. He built incredible training systems, built a training college, grew rapidly. We made a $17 million investment in 2014, which at the time was the biggest private equity investment in the country. Company continued to go rapidly, became very profitable, did an IPO. We didn't sell then. We could only own 30%, which was the max that a foreign investor could own, but we eventually sold for 4 times our investment. So I think we played a key role in being the first outside investor in the financial sector in Sri Lanka, so that was pretty visible. Other private equity funds came in later. But it was really the relationship with this guy, Roshan, that I still revel in. I went to board meetings 4 times a year as a regulated institution. We had monthly phone calls, which my time was midnight till 3 in the morning. I did that once I wasn't in Sri Lanka, so I was pretty active there. So it was a good experience.
Great. So Salli, who are your investors? Who gives money into your Any SGI members?
Yes, yes, we do have a few. I just had to write those down too. But we do have churches. We do have the School Sisters of Notre Dame, Sisters of St. Dominic, the School Sisters of St. Francis, Wisconsin Council of Churches, the Basilian Fathers of Toronto, just to name a few. So we have religious investors around the state, around the country. And we also have financial institutions, banks, credit unions. We have a number of individuals. We also have foundations, and some nonprofits also look at us as a way to invest their resting money in nonprofit activity that's occurring throughout the state.
Do you take deposits?
No, we don't.
In
No, investments, so they are literally investments. There's a loan that's created between the investor and us.
Okay, so we have some SGI members on board. Just a thought, if you're all looking for places to put your money.
Yes, we can use more.
Yeah, exactly. This has been a paid political announcement.
And I'm not just a great dressed guy either, so.
Okay. Sure.
So along those lines, George, you got your loan for your building side. You're also talking about investing
Yes.
in different communities.
Yes.
Who would be the type of, would you go back to Salli for that, or do you have other investors that you're looking for to help kind of seed or fund, the community development?
Yes.
So my question was basically, George was talking about how he got his loan for his building from Salli, but he's also got a second, your mission, right? Your mission is to help those in poverty. And so are you going back for money to help those in poverty to Salli, or do you have outside investors, and what type of investors are those?
I think what we're going to try to do is to do things like this, is be in audiences that we can be in, to explain that there is an opportunity. And at the same time, we're getting people ready. I mean, individual, I call myself an entrepreneur. I ran hospitals and all kinds of stuff for profit, even though we're not for profit. So they need to learn what that means and how to survive, because running a business is not easy. And there's a lot of risk that when you put your own personal funds in there, you're also putting risk out there yourself. So we want to help people who have great ideas find the tools, skills necessary to increase the probability of success, and then introduce them to possible lending opportunities. And there are some really great organizations that are out there that's doing that. It's just that you have to, it's a partnership almost. Because we're dealing with a very sophisticated economy. It's not one where you can have $100 and make a turn. We're up against a lot of really sophisticated businesses when we go into business. And so we have to not only be ready to have the financial backing, but also some of the tools and skills necessary to survive. Yeah. So it's not just financial investment. It's about investment in the skills necessary to make sure that your investment's going to have a return. And that's also important, I think.
Okay, are there any other questions? There's one back there.
Has John opened the floodgates here?
Some of you sort of answered this question, but it's for each of you. I'm going to give each one of you $1 million. And on the horizon, whether it be investment, impact investing, equity, asset, or whatever, what one thing do you see that needs to have the most impact at this time? If you look at the horizon, you say, this is where it needs to go.
Well, can I choose two? No.
You didn't go to Catholic school, did you?
The climate crisis, climate solutions, and the refugee crisis. No, I said the climate solutions being one, climate crisis / climate solutions, and the refugee crisis. So.
Doing what we do, I would look at housing today. housing. There's a dearth of housing, affordable quality housing in the state, actually across the U.S. And people are living in substandard homes, and that's causing a lot of problems, both from an economic perspective, from a health perspective, just across the board. So it would be, for me, it would be housing. And in terms of, we would lend the money, we would lend the money to our emerging developers, to organizations like SDC. They would develop the homes, pay us back, develop the homes, pay us back. So sustainability in the circle of lending, so to speak.
I work in emerging market financial services, so I'll kind of stick to that. But I think education finance, I mean, even in countries where incomes are growing, they're really struggling to find schools and places where their kids can go to school. The public sector schools are probably failing for the most part, or are keeping up with the population growth. So people who are really starting investing in small micro schools are probably a big need.
I would just say housing would be one, but I would want neighborhood economic development as a second one, because in our community we have an issue with transportation. I'm not trying to fight that. That's something we got to get over as a community in our head. But if we start developing our own solutions in our own communities, I think that's going to have greater impact for the people who live in the community.
I'm Reg McKillop with the Cincinnati Dominican Sisters out of Wisconsin. And since the 1990s, we've had what we've called an alternative investment fund of over $1 million that we have been loaning. And we have two categories. We have what I think most of you are describing, what we call intermediary organizations that we invest in and you invest in others. We've looked at Forward a couple of times. But our struggle right now is, if we talk about impact, is, well, I don't know how many invest in Leviticus Fund. I know that's a big funding. Do they really need our money is a question we keep on asking, because their portfolio is quite humongous. So we're looking more at what are riskier but direct loans, directly to groups that we don't go through an intermediary. And I'm wondering, one of the difficulties is that we can't find them. We don't know where to go to find them. Sometimes it's word of mouth. Our sister's working in a particular area and she sees a group that's a startup and says, hey, could you use a loan? A lot of people are looking for grants, which we don't give through this fund. I wonder if you have any advice as to where to find people that would be a direct loan is what I'm referring to, but I think would have more of our money would have more of an impact. It's a higher risk, but our record has been, I think in the 30 years, almost 30 years that we've been loaning, there's only been 2 organizations that we've had to call back, and I think a lot of you know Blue Dot.
Oh, yeah.
No, okay, is one, but it's only been 2. So our record is very good, so.
You know, what I would like to see, to be quite honest, is a group of investors commit to invest. Work with our communities to identify projects that make sense and then invest in that. Because even when you do housing, you have to do it in a strategic way, else you're wasting your money. So it really needs to be about how do we invest in a project that may have a lot of different things going on, but they're feeding on each other. That's a strategic approach to investing. And we don't do a good job of that in this city, or in our city. We just, we kind of throw money too much, just throw it. And we don't think through how we're going to build a strategy and then invest in a strategy, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Anybody else want to cover it?
Yeah, so A couple things. One, I would encourage you to get, if you're not already connected, get connected with the Catholic Impact Investment Collaborative. It's a group of similar Catholic institutions, and we're sharing resources, we're sharing due diligence, and so I think that you'll learn about certain direct lending opportunities through SEEK. I encourage us to exchange information, because we have a director of impact investing, Cuyahoga Alliance, who's on our staff and works internally, and she's starting to find them, but it's not easy, but it's just kind of happening organically. So we should connect. And some of the intermediaries, like Calvert, have vehicles or platforms for direct investing. Whether or not those borrowers need our money, I don't know, but there definitely are opportunities to do direct lending via the existing impact financial intermediaries.
And if you're interested in my idea, contact me too. Forgot to sell.
Other questions? Don't be shy.
If we're just getting into this impact investing, is there a minimum? I mean, it depends on what you have to give toward it. I understand that. But what is a meaningful start if we were to give some assets to one of your groups, and what would you say is an amount that would be a starting amount?
We operate only closed-end funds. We're not currently fundraising. It'll probably be another couple of years, but our minimum is about $250,000 for a limited partnership investment, but it's tied up. You commit, investor commits money to the fund. We draw it over a 2 to 3 year, 4 year period as we make the investments, but then it's illiquid. So that's sort of the typical limited partnership private equity model. But we're trying to get 250 as sort of a minimum entry point.
Any other questions?
CDFIs, very often have lower minimums.
What's your
So
minimum?
typically, yes, thank you. For CDFIs, typically it's $1,000 is that threshold, or the low end of the threshold. A lot of us will have investments as much as several $1 million from one investor.
And I often find that impact funds are flexible and say that their minimum is $5 million or $1 million, but for you.
Take whatever we can get.
We'll make it 500,000.
Greg, I have a question for you. For an institution or congregation that is just getting started, what kind of internal expertise do they need? What kind of administrative effort is required here? It's very different than investing in the public equities market or a fixed income market, where all the vetting is done and you don't have to do this messy social return piece. So how much internal resources do you need to put towards this?
Well, yeah, it's a good question. I think it varies. In making private investments, via kind of an internal office can be laborious, but I don't think that should be a deterrent. I think that there are, I mentioned SEEK. I think that if you talk to similar organizations, if you talk to us, if you talk to other organizations, you can kind of learn how others have started, how they've done it. You don't necessarily need to, in our case, we're fairly unique. We hired an internal, a dedicated impact investment professional. Most organizations can't do that. It was kind of a stretch for us to do it, but we thought it was the right thing to do. There are plenty of consultants, individual consultants out there, not folks who are going to, invest your assets, but folks who might have worked on internally within a foundation or within for an asset owner building out an impact investment portfolio, who can spend some time thinking about a strategy, impact investment strategy with you and with your financial advisors and how to execute it. And there are some external boutique firms that can help to actually invest the money if that's something that you would want or choose to do. So I think the starting point is to talk to similar organizations.
Any other questions? We have one down here, sir.
Now, I just want to chime in on Reg's question. I would say the due diligence question is the biggest. And I think there's more and more, as Greg has mentioned, that there are a number of different groups trying to share the due diligence, because I don't do it, our CIO does it, and I just watch the amount of hours that he has to put into that. And it's just exorbitant. And so any way in which that can be shared, because you may be all looking at the same investment or the same fund, you may want to look at it from slightly different angles, but there is a kind of a base there. And I think the other one is, since we do mostly international, who your partners are is very important. So a lot of our partners are OPIC, the IFC, the Inter-American Development Bank, the Africa Development Bank. So they bring a level of experience and expertise that we can't touch. So that's another place where that you can draw on. And the final thing I'd say is no matter what amount you have that you're interested in putting in there, there's going to be somebody who's interested in taking it, wherever they start, because there's that many projects out there and that many places looking for capital.
Okay. Question back there.
I'm Felipe Witchker, and I work at a cooperative, and I'm just curious about alternative ownership as a key for investing. And particular, I know equity in cooperatives is a challenging thing. There's multi-stakeholder cooperatives that are emerging that are making it more viable. I'm on the board of a accelerator called Start.coop that's accelerating co-ops of Uber and Lyft drivers and other important pieces of the economy. Another question is investment. Is anybody thinking about investing in economics teaching and thinking, right? I think we know our discipline is so consolidated domestically, and going to Pope Francis and Pope Benedict and thinking about their encyclicals and Bruni and Zamagni and some of the civil economy literature that they have developed in Italy and other part of the world. Just curious if we're thinking that kind of investment long term and a new imagination for some of what we have in terms of investing. And then a third question is just personally, racial equity. I try to put a lot of my money direct investment to people like resource generation, networks of people of color, entrepreneurs in particular. And so kind of building off of that question, curious there.
Okay, who'd like to tackle that? Or parts of it, at least.
Alternative ownership, as in cooperative structures. I think it's a really good idea. I think there's definitely certainly a need for it, right? If you look at all of the wealth that's been generated in this country and globally, but specifically in this country over the last 30 years. Well, just take the current bull market. The last 10 years, I think I read something that the percentage of Americans that actually benefited, actually owned assets, in this, public equity markets is very, very small. Mm-hmm. And so there's definitely a need for rethinking the model for generating wealth for, everyone else. So I think cooperative structures and similar structures are a very good idea.
I also know that those are being discussed in the community. Mm-hmm. On various different levels about housing, co-ops around businesses and stuff. It seems to be a strategy that's beginning to have some legs, very much in its infancy stages in the community. But I know that there's several groups that are talking about it right now, and so that's where some of these opportunities that I was discussing may be some investment opportunities.
And I do think to that end also, it's not just the fact that there's a need. I think it's a requirement today. You know, if we look at the fact that where we've been or where we are as a society today, when we look at the distribution of wealth and what's happened, is the fact that we have to start thinking differently, and what are the other systems that can be created to really break some of that down, because it is about community wealth building, and how do we grow that differently than what we have in the past.
In the developing world, I see quite a bit of very grassroots, organic levels, small farmer groups. They've tended to work better when they're informal and sort of started by the people themselves. Top-down cooperatives have gotten a pretty bad name coming out of communism and some of the top-down approaches that didn't work very well. But at a grassroots level, they're still pretty effective in rural areas in particular.
Okay.
Do we want to ask, investing in thinking, I think was your economic thinking was your second question. That's, we need to generate financial return, with our impact investments. So they're probably a foundation type investment. Certainly I'm all for it. It's probably not going to be in our wheelhouse.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I say for my business, I don't get any grants or anybody paying for thinking. I would love to have a little bit more investment in the thought process of what we're trying to do. It would definitely make a huge return on what we could probably do to help our communities get out of poverty, but there is no funds unless you find a foundation nationally that's going to say, I want you to do this. But we don't invest enough in the whole process of thinking through how to resolve some of these issues that we have in our community.
A number of other institutions were invested in do quite a bit with financial literacy, training and education, and it's somewhat self-serving because they want their borrowers to know what they're getting into and what they're doing, but I see quite a bit of good work going on, including more electronically on mobile phones and iPads and things, so there's quite a bit going on.
Okay. Any other questions? If there are no more questions, I think I would just say that there's so much important stuff that came out in this panel. I would also say that for those of you that belong to religious congregations, I think that you might want to contact Greg to sign up for the CIIC, the Catholic Impact Investing Collaborative. And I think Chris told me that the link is going to be on the SGI website pretty soon. It'll be tomorrow in our e-newsletter because Chris is not going to sleep tonight. He's going right home and he's going to do the newsletter. And I cannot thank enough our participants today. Ken Vanderveel, Salli, Martyniak, George Hinton, thank you, and for adding class to this gathering. And Greg Lane, definitely thank you for your input on this, especially for those of us in religious congregations. You give us some insight as to how to approach our own. So thank you all.
It looked like George had something you wanted to add there.
Well, I just wanted to say thank you for allowing me to be uncomfortable enough to be in a room full of people who don't look like me.
Oh, yes.
A bunch of financial people, which I am not. And then people coming from a financial lens when I'm coming from a community lens. It's a great opportunity. We should do this more often. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Well, I look forward to the day when we look in some ways less like we do now and more like the community at large. So,
yes.
Hopefully we'll be moving that direction. But the first step we'll be taking, after we've thanked our panel with an applause, we also want to thank everybody who was a part of putting this together. But we're going to be stepping outside for our next moment for some food and some beverage. And also after that, while we're out there, we'll hear a few more words, if you'd be so kind, when we ask you to kind of pull your attention back and listen. So maybe another round of applause for our panel. and we can make our way right out that way for the reception.
Okie dokie.
Thank you. Pleasure
Oh,
meeting
thank
you.
you.
Nice to
This
meet
was
you.
This evening, I want to say thank you very much for joining us. My name is Dan Trado, and I'm the president of the board of Seventh Generation Coalition for Responsible Investing. It's my pleasure, and on behalf of the board, I want to say thank you for your attention and for your time this evening, for spending moments of your day to be with us and to share the important messages that we've just begun. And they're like any resolution, any company we work with, we're just always at the beginning of a relationship and hope to continue that for a good long time. I want to say thanks to our host, Marquette University, for offering us their facility, and their supply chain school for thinking of us and keeping us as part of their program. I also want to thank our board and the planning committee that put this event together. I'm so happy that you are all to be able to take a part in it, and I want to introduce to you our executive director and the staff. I have to say thanks to our staff, to Natalie, Chris, Frank, for putting this program together and to be leaders for us and with us. So, Frank.
Thanks, Jim. Before I say a few words about the activities of Seventh Generation Interfaith, can we get a hand for our many sponsors that made this event possible and make our mission possible? That's in your program. Can we get a round of applause? This past season has been a significant one for Seventh Generation, both in our growth and in our impact. The merger with Midwest Coalition for Responsible Investment with SGI this past summer brought 10 new members to our membership, bringing our membership to 39 faith and values-based investors. MCRI's executive director, Sister Barbara Jennings, taught me some of the skills of being a professional shareholder advocate as she led MCRI for the last 15 years in their engagements and made significant impact with companies like Monsanto, Boeing, and Ameren Energy. She now is my boss. She joined our board this past spring, along with Sister Carmen Schneider. Her retirement didn't last very long, I have to say. Not only did she join our board, but she was had a recent announcement as the chancellor of Fontbonne University. So Sister Barbara is very busy these days. Now this addition to our membership led to an addition to our staff. Natalie Wasek comes to SGI as a shareholder advocacy manager, a St. Bonaventure University graduate with the enviable majors of accounting and theology. Sounds like a perfect match for us, right? But she also spent her last year as a Franciscan volunteer working for the Sisters of St. Francis of Philadelphia under Sister Nora Nash, another pioneer and pillar of the ICCR community. So we're very fortunate to have Natalie. We expanded our board to 9 members this afternoon at our meeting, electing Peg Growth, the Sisters of the Sorrowful Mother, Sister Ruth Battaglia of the Congregation of St. Agnes, and Cindy Boland of Riverwater Partners to our board. Can I get them to raise their hands so that they can be recognized? Also at this afternoon's meeting, we discussed our shareholder advocacy work, the core work of SGI. We're engaging nearly 80 companies on priority issues such as human rights, climate change, water stewardship, food justice, health equity, and corporate governance. SGI members work in coalition with other investor groups, from ICCR to pension funds to foundations to unions and to large, now I'm happy to say, large asset managers who have come to the table. We insist that all stakeholder rights be recognized by corporate boards. We work closely with NGOs and civil society groups to ensure that government corporate engagement strategies integrate the perspectives of impacted people and communities. And we've made an impact. In this past year, our members were instrumental in getting Yum Brands to pursue science-based greenhouse gas reduction targets. And let me lift up Sister Marge Clark for her work there. We encouraged WEC Energy and CMS Energy to publish 2-degree scenario plan studies and helped convince MGE Energy to set a net zero emissions target. And there, Sister Ruth Garretts, Tim Duane, and Dan Trito all contributed and led those endeavors. We got Kraft Heinz to publish a human rights policy, and Boeing to reconsider their lobbying disclosures. Brother Robert Watitka led those engagements. We convinced Macy's and TJX to look more closely at their supply chain for labor abuses, and Mark Peters has been a diligent member in leading those engagements. Many of our members are now at the table talking to corporations, sharing their prophetic voice in demanding an economy that indeed works for all of us. As I stand on the shoulders of Mike Crosby and others who shared in this, started this movement, I want to thank you. Still too early, Mike. I want to thank you for joining us in this journey. Okay, and now, if I can invite Sister Carmen Snyder to the floor. From the Sisters of Precious Blood. Most precious blood. Most precious blood. I cannot get all these numbers. And an SGI board member to come forward for a special presentation.
I am honored to be invited to present an award to a person that I have worked very closely with for the last 15 years or so. She has been executive director of the Midwest CRI, and she's passionate about the environment and good governance. She's led our CRI in engagements with companies that we were all interested in our CRI, and in wanting them to be better corporate citizens of their local communities. These companies include Boeing, which is now Bayer, Ameren, our local electric facility, and did I say Boeing was not Bayer? Yes. Sorry. Boeing, Monsanto, which is now Bayer. I did that wrong. Yeah, real breaking. Yeah. These have been successful engagements for us because of her dedication to discussing issues with them that we were both interested in their company and us as members of the CRI. She has had a good working rapport with these companies. She has led our conference through calls and face-to-face dialogues. And because of her dedication to the work of SGI and to the UN Principles for a Better World, I'm honored to present the Father Mike Crosby Award to Sister Barbara Jennings.
Well, thank you very much. This is quite an honor, especially Mike Crosby, who I always found he was so focused on the issues that he took up, and particularly the tobacco issue. And he certainly got tobacco companies to label their products, along with the government, but he probably
he had some influence there.
He had influence on the government too. So, and on the behalf of children in our world, throughout our world. So thank you very much. It's just been very fun working with the Midwest Coalition. It's like lobbying, but it's lobbying corporations and not the government. And as I urge you to remember, this is fun work and it actually gets results.